Thank you everybody for joining us today. Just bear with us as we allow everybody to enter the waiting room. We will start momentarily. Here we go. Thank you all for joining us. Well, good afternoon. Thank you everybody for joining us today. This is the second session of this series. We appreciate your time. I would like to introduce Professor Paul Peterson, Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government and Director of the Program on Education Policy and Governance. Paul?
Thank you, Antonio. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second session of the conference entitled A Safe Place to Learn. We hold these sessions weekly at noon to 1 o'clock Eastern Time on Fridays, and that'll be up through June 3rd. The conference is sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance at the Kennedy School. I'm Paul Peterson. I'm the director of the program. Thank you for joining us. As the pandemic has subsided and schools have returned to in-person learning in almost all places, school staff are reporting bullying, fighting, and many other behavioral problems that are at a scale that has not been seen prior to the pandemic. But we still have limited information on just how much has changed and how serious the problems are. To shed further light on this question, we have invited 3 experts to discuss the school safety issue and to present their research and fieldwork on the topic. I'm pleased that we have had expert administrative help from Antonio Wentland, Nick Tavares, and Michael Poor. Thank you all for helping organize the background for the conference. And I'm also pleased to introduce Daniel Hamlin, a professor of education at the University of Oklahoma. He's an expert on the topic, and he has helped to organize the conference. And he and I are going to share the duties of moderator during the session today. So Daniel, I turn the floor over to you.
All right, well, thank you, Paul. So I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists today. So our first panelist is Kalyn Belsha. She's a national reporter for Chalkbeat, and she's covered many of the recent issues related to school safety. And she's also previously covered issues in education for the Chicago Reporter, Catalyst Chicago, and the Chicago Tribune. Our second panelist is Josh Goodman. He's an associate professor of education and economics at the Wheelock College of Education and Human Development at Boston University. A prolific researcher, his work on education policy is featured in many of the nation's top economics, public policy, and education journals. Finally, we have Betheny Gross. She is Director of Research at Western Governors University Labs, and she's co-author of Strife and Progress, an early account of cities' experiences implementing the portfolio strategy. She also has a number of many influential studies that appear in the nation's top ed policy journals. So very quickly to the audience, we hope to make the latter half of the session as interactive as possible, and we of course encourage you to post your questions. You'll notice there's a Q&A function in Zoom, so go ahead and post your questions there. If you can keep them succinct, that'll be great, because that'll allow Paul and I to identify the questions and then pose them to the panelists. So with that, thank you all to the panelists, and why don't we turn things over to Kalyn first.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share some slides here. Okay. So I am a national reporter at Chalkbeat, which means that I kind of stay in touch with teachers, counselors, social workers all over the country. So I'm not doing research per se, but I am talking with lots of educators, and school discipline has been a topic that I've been paying attention to for many years. I'm based in Illinois, which was one of the early states that worked a lot on restorative practices. And I've been watching the kinds of laws that are in place to try to reduce suspensions and expulsions. So during the pandemic, something that me and many of my colleagues were wondering about was how would the expected behavior challenges that students might be having affect like kind of coincide with what was happening nationally, where there had been a big movement to try to reduce suspensions and expulsions. And of course, as the pandemic was happening during the murder of George Floyd, we saw many, many school districts move to try to curtail the presence of police on campuses. We also saw lots of conversations about persisting discipline inequities. So these things were all kind of live and happening during the pandemic and interfering all at once. So that's been something that I've been paying attention to. So last school year, I have to say that, something that we thought might happen that did not happen was that there'd be some kind of like uptick in discipline last year. From the data that I have seen for the 2020 to 2021 school year, for the most part, suspensions and expulsions were way down, which is to be expected during remote learning. A lot of schools weren't using those traditional forms of punishment. But we did start to hear kind of early concerns from staff about how people were responding to student behavior. And there were lots of discipline actions that were being taken that didn't fit neatly into the boxes that we normally use to categorize how discipline happens. So maybe we weren't seeing traditional suspensions and expulsions out of the school building, but we did see some weird things like giving kids tickets for masking and calling it like a trumped up safety violation if they pulled their mask down, or if they maybe spit or did something to a student that they considered like a big health risk. We saw some school districts, like in Texas, created like very high punishments for something like that. We also saw smaller things like teachers who would mute a mic or maybe not allow a student into a virtual classroom. This didn't happen a lot, but it certainly was a form of discipline that didn't fit into the same box. And so we didn't really know what to do with it. We saw some folks were also changing their student code of conduct to use this kind of discipline. So I think I still don't have a great handle on how often that happened last year, because a lot of it was kind of not recorded, was kind of off the books. We heard anecdotally from teachers that they were seeing it happen, but I think we still need to do more research to see how common that was and how other forms of discipline were used last year. But in general, suspensions and expulsions were way down. So over the summer, we talked to a lot of educators about what they were thinking that the new school year would be like. And right away, we heard from lots of folks that they thought that this was going to be a very challenging school year. I don't think anyone started in the fall thinking that it was going to be like the easiest transition. And I think that, for school mental health workers that I talked with, social workers and counselors, they especially were expecting a lot of behavior challenges. And some of the folks I talked to, like even they were surprised with what they were seeing. I don't have great data on it, but there were a fair number of school districts that reported more fighting that was happening right away in the first 2 months of the school year. Denver is a notable example. And we saw a lot of counselors and teachers just like kind of were very overwhelmed. They too were trying to adjust in-person learning if they had been remote learning last year. So there was just a lot going on and kids were trying to get used to new rules and expectations. Some of the common things that we heard were that students were behind in their social and emotional skills by 1 to 2 grade levels, which could mean anything from maybe hitting a classmate on the playground to not being able to follow the rules and being asked to have to like leave the classroom. And we did hear a lot of mental health workers were saying that they were seeing an uptick in evidence of students experiencing symptoms of anxiety. And a lot of school districts also were using screeners more frequently. And so they were asking students how they were feeling more. So we definitely heard a lot more report around the stress and mental health problems that students were experiencing. So what we're watching now, I'm actually in the process right now with a colleague of trying to gather discipline data for this school year for the 30 largest school districts. And I have to say, it has been a real challenge. A lot of school districts don't like to release school discipline data mid-school year or before the end of the school year. So a lot of folks have told us, we haven't looked at that yet, so we don't have to provide it to you. So we're also going through school board records and trying to find anything we can that is out there. So I have to say right now, it's a real hodgepodge. You've probably seen lots of headlines, but I would say that there's not great like overall data about what we have or what is happening this year. There have been some notable school districts, large school districts, that have reported an uptick in suspensions and expulsions. So I noted those here. Clark County was one of them, and Pitt County in North Carolina, and Fulton County is experiencing more fighting and expulsions. But that is not the case around like the whole country. A lot of folks haven't released any data at all. So it's been really hard for us to know what's happening on a national scale. Something we did see in a couple of Georgia districts was that they were asking the students not to use their lockers and to carry clear backpacks after there had been an uptick in weapons being brought to school, which we had seen, pre-pandemic too. But there's still so many open questions about what's actually happening and how widespread those trends are. Okay. So I think the big two questions for me are like kind of what happens with school policing and what happens with the conversation around restorative justice. Right now we have seen a couple of school districts that remove their SROs, their school resource officers or police officers between 2020 and 2021. Because of remote learning, a lot of folks didn't have great data on how that affected students. And so this is really the first school year that we're going to have good data from those districts about what that means and how students' perceptions of safety were affected. So Chicago, where I'm based, for example, is getting ready to release some of their new data around the removal of school police. And we don't really know yet how that affected it. And not every high school got rid of their SRO. So we're waiting for that data. I am waiting for it very anxiously, but in a lot of places it just doesn't exist yet. There are some notable examples that I was able to find of school districts that kind of reversed course. And although they had wanted to get rid of police, there was some kind of high profile incident that happened, and then they brought them back. I think in both of these cases here in Montgomery County and Alexandria, it was a student who brought a weapon to school or a student who was injured on campus. So those are obviously rare and don't happen as much, but it can cause these large discussions that were happening for years and years to suddenly reverse course. So we are watching that very closely to see if districts that had big reckonings over school police bring them back. We've seen it in a couple cases, but not all. And something else I've been noting on teacher Twitter is that there's been a lot of conversation around restorative justice and whether or not it has a place right now. I think a lot of schools are still doing that. They're still doing circles. They're still not suspending and expelling kids that much. But I think there's a lot of dialogue I've heard about whether or not there should be harsher punishments available to teachers right now. And so that's something I'm following very, very closely because that would be a real reversal of what we've seen over the last decade. But I think it's really an open question and it's just kind of like dialogue that we're following, but we don't know a lot yet. And I think kind of after we get the data from this school year at the end, we'll have a lot better idea of kind of what's happening and whether or not suspensions and expulsions were used more this year.
All right, thank you very much. Josh?
Thanks very much. Let me just find my screen. Does it look okay? Great. Well, thanks very much for having me. That was a great kickoff by Kalyn to think about what's been going on with student behavior in schools. I particularly appreciate the focus on the sort of what's been happening very recently. What I'm going to present to you now is really more focused on the first year post-pandemic from sort of March of 2020 through February of the following year. This is joint work with my colleague, Andrew Bacher-Hicks, my colleagues, Andrew Bacher-Hicks, Jennifer Green, and Melissa Holt. And let's just get into it, if I can. There we go. Okay, so motivation for the research that is the focus of my talk today is that for fairly obvious reasons, school-based bullying and cyberbullying have been the focus of a lot of policy and legislative initiatives in recent years. Just to give you a sense of statistics, about 20% of US high school students report having been bullied at school in the prior year, and about 16% report having been cyberbullied. Youth involved in bullying report all sorts of terrible outcomes, suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety, as well as things that seem to last longer into adulthood. And though COVID has obviously been hugely disruptive and damaging to students, I see it in my own 3 elementary school age kids, but we argue in this research that actually the remote schooling triggered by COVID seems to have actually lowered rates of school bullying and cyberbullying, at least temporarily. And I want to stress that this is not a statement about what is going on now as a result of COVID, but what was happening in the first year and what we can learn from that. So just to set the stage, there were a lot of concerns about bullying during the pandemic, particularly with the shift to remote learning and the idea that because kids were going to be spending a lot more time online, there was an expectation among many writers and folks who think about this stuff that cyberbullying was going to increase dramatically as a result of this increased time online by students. But it turns out it's very hard to get good data about bullying and cyberbullying, both in general, but particularly during the pandemic when data was hard to come by. And so what we're going to do in this research, it's actually the second paper in which we've done something like this, is to use internet search data that Google makes available through the Google Trends website, what Google makes available are measures of the extent to which people are searching either nationally or by state or even by smaller geographic regions for various search terms. And you can go to the website right now and type in whatever search term is of interest to you. And so I'm just showing you the graph you get when you type in the term bullying. We're going to focus for this paper on three measures: school bullying, cyberbullying, and the total of those two, which we just call bullying. And the reason we think this data is really valuable is that bullying is something that's normally very hard to observe, and particularly hard to observe evolving in real time. So the best observations we have of this behavior come from surveys that maybe happen once a year, maybe once every couple of years, but really don't give us a fine-grained look into what's going on in students' lives. And as I said, this is related to earlier work by me, Andrew, and Christine Mulhern, showing that internet search can actually provide really valuable information on the educational choices and experiences people are having in real time. And so to convince you that internet search is actually a good measure of actual bullying behavior, I'm going to relate it to probably the best measure we have of actual bullying behavior, which comes from the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey. This is a large sample of US high schoolers that happens every couple of years. And in particular, the last few waves, they've asked the question, during the past 12 months, have you ever been bullied on school property, or have you ever been electronically bullied? And so we're going to sort of take these student self-reports of answers to these questions as probably the best measures we have. And I'm going to show you three pieces of evidence that the search data actually relates to that stuff pretty well. So three quick pieces of evidence that pre-pandemic search data really does contain information about actual school bullying. The first is that we've just shown you over the course of the calendar year what the pattern in internet search for school bullying, for bullying in general, looks like. Actually, I should say this is school bullying, but it looks like this for cyberbullying as well. And the key thing is that it matches the school calendar very well, which is that search for bullying, school bullying, cyberbullying, drop off substantially during the summertime when school is not in session, and then return when the school returns to session in the fall and stays fairly level throughout the school year. You actually see small dips in months like December when there are longer breaks and kids are in school less. But the point is that over the course of the school calendar, the search for bullying matches what we'd expect from exposure to potential bullies pretty well. Another piece of pre-pandemic evidence is that, as I mentioned to you before, this Youth Risk Behavior Survey allows us to say how much students report being bullied or cyberbullied. And it turns out their answers suggest that school bullying is about 30% more common than cyberbullying. And remarkably, over that same pre-pandemic period, search intensity, internet search intensity for school bullying is also almost exactly 30% higher than internet search intensity for cyberbullying. So it seems like the relative magnitudes of these things also tracks. And then finally, we show evidence that pre-pandemic, states where students report high levels of being bullied in school in the self-reported surveys are also states in the US where there is much higher levels of internet search for bullying. So all three of these pieces of evidence suggest that at least pre-pandemic, internet search contains real information about actual bullying and cyberbullying behavior. And so what we then show in this paper is that if we continue the time series out to post-pandemic from about March 2020 to where we stopped the paper, which was February of 2021, we see historically unprecedented drops in search intensity for both school and cyberbullying in the raw data. And so over the course of the first post-pandemic year, we see that bullying search drops by about 30%, driven by a particularly large drop in search for school bullying and a smaller but still large drop in cyberbullying. And these changes are concentrated while school is in session, with summers actually looking pretty normal relative to historical norms. We also show in the paper, using data from Burbio that tracks the extent of school reopenings, that places where schools reopened more saw a faster and higher return to sort of pre-pandemic normal levels of internet search for bullying and cyberbullying terms. And so bullying reverts closer to these pre-COVID levels in states with a larger fraction of schools returning in person. And one way to think about our estimates is that it implies for the 2020-21 school year that if no schools had ever offered in-person instruction, search for bullying would have dropped by over 50%. And even if all schools had offered in-person instruction, bullying search would have dropped, but only by about 20%. And so, we think that these findings suggest that online search for bullying has patterns suggesting that it's a very good proxy for actual bullying. And that's true at all points in time, particularly pre-pandemic, but that post-pandemic, the data suggests that school-based and cyberbullying have declined, at least in that first year post-pandemic, very likely because school closings actually cut off contact between students and prevented a lot of these behaviors. And in fact, we see evidence in the data that as schools started to reopen, pre-pandemic bullying patterns started returning to normal. One thing that's particularly striking about our results is that cyberbullying does not seem to be substituting for school bullying. In other words, when COVID forced students all online, it didn't actually generate more cyberbullying, it generated less, which suggests that this evidence is at least consistent with the hypothesis that many experts in bullying believe, that most cyberbullying actually originates in person. So when you cut off that in-person sort of instigating incidents, you actually cut off the cyberbullying as well. And so I think our work raises some questions about why the pandemic and the move to virtual instruction disrupted bullying. We think some of the answers are obvious, like there was much less contact overall between peers. In virtual instruction, students are arguably more closely observed by their teachers than they are in the typical school building. And in particular, in the pandemic world, even when kids were returning to school, there were many fewer unstructured moments in hallways, at lunchtime, outside the building, because of the ways that schools had implemented sort of COVID safety protocols. And it's those unstructured moments that tend to allow for some of these bullying behaviors to really metastasize. So I just want to be clear, this work doesn't measure the impact of the pandemic and school closures on future bullying rates. In other words, is there the kind of long-term damage that Kalyn was beginning to hint at with the data that they're seeing now? But I do think some of this work suggests that there's something interesting that schools, some lessons that schools might draw from pandemic era schooling to keep bullying rates lower now that the world is starting to return to some kind of normal. And so with that, I'll stop and thank you for listening to me.
All right, thank you very much. Bethany?
Sure, thanks, Josh. That was really interesting. I'm just gonna pull up some slides. All right, well, I'll just start by saying I actually had to think, kind of hard about how I would present the content that I have for today, because I hadn't really thought about it in the context of safety and security. I don't study, and I don't think of myself as a school safety expert. I don't study acts of aggression or violence or bullying. But what I did do last year is spend a large portion of the year, actually between 2020 when the pandemic started through the summer of 2021, really trying to understand the experiences of young people through the pandemic and through their schooling. And one of the things I started to do with some colleagues is just look through the trends around students' mental health and well-being during that period of time. And as I reflected back and reread, things I wrote a year ago, what I started to really understand is that a thing that is fundamentally very unsafe for kids is a pandemic. And just to put some context around this, the numbers of what students experience and the sort of social psychological context that they're bringing back into school this year, I think can be summed up in a set of statistics from the previous years. We're now closing in on about 1 million Americans having died from COVID, untold numbers of grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. 144,000 children are estimated to have lost a primary or secondary caregiver to COVID. This is a huge number of kids. And as deaths continues, this will still continue to be a rising number. the CDC estimated that, the effects for young girls and young women were particularly striking. Suspected suicide attempts for girls aged 12 to 17 increased about 51, they estimate about 51% by March 2021. A shocking number for sure. In surveys done by an organization called Youth Truth, it had a series of surveys that ran through the pandemic that, at one point, over 50% of kids said that they had reported that they'd felt personally affected by the pandemic. Isolation, stress, uncertainty, these all breed, negative effects and negative social psychological effects for young people, for sure. In, one study, more than 40% of students were reporting, markers that are associated with, negative cognitive and emotional health, including the inability to concentrate, make decisions, feel happy. In a Tennessee study, 75% of students were saying that it was really hard for them to do well in school under the stresses of COVID. And the effects are really accumulating. And there's certainly, we know these effects to be very, to impact students, some students more than others. Almost all of the studies that I looked at saw differential effects for students of Asian descent, Black students, Hispanic students, Indigenous students, LGBTQ students, students with disabilities, and students who are in lower income households. And the effects are really affecting, kids at the physiological level as well. There were changes in students' diet, their exercise, weight, sleep, and for children who had pre-existing neurological conditions, they saw upticks in the effects of those conditions, including headaches, epileptic episodes. So kids were feeling this emotionally, they were feeling this year physically as well. And over 50% of participants in one study it reports that kids were reporting increased health conditions, negative health conditions during the pandemic. I mean, this is all like a backdrop for what Kalyn is observing in schools this year, what Josh was observing during the pandemic. And this is going to have sort of a lingering and continuing effect. We can see these data continuing to play out in the reports of students' mental health and well-being as we continue through whatever this phase of the pandemic is. And it goes on. And that, all of this is sort of leading up to, this is all walking into our schools, and schools, are really struggling to keep up with this. We know from the pandemic with some surveys of school administrators and teachers that they worked tirelessly and mightily to try to add supports. In survey after survey of teachers and administrators, we learned that teachers were trying to do more. This was a priority concern for them. They knew that this was that children were being affected emotionally, socially, and psychologically. They were adding supports. One study shows that about 56% of districts reported adding new supports for mental health supports for students. Still, even in that same survey, still 77% of administrators felt like their children and students were falling behind on social and emotional development. Like this is now like looking like a very widespread concern. The question is, what do we do? So about a year ago, I was part of a panel of child development and mental health support experts who thought about the recovery. What do we do when we have to support kids as we bring them back into schools? And how can we make this school space one part and one robust part of the sort of circle of care that that children need. And so, we had a really interesting discussion reflecting on the data, many of data points I presented here and others to sort of start to put together an agenda of how do we move forward. Before I get into that, I do want to also say one thing and make one thing very clear, is that young people, and I observed this in the qualitative data collection that I was doing through the year, and you can also see this in some of the survey and other data, is they showed many of them showed remarkable resilience through this. I spoke with dozens of students through the pandemic, and a common theme across them was that they were rejecting the narrative of loss that is so present in the data that I showed, and they were rejecting this narrative even as they were describing what they were giving up, what wasn't happening for them, the time they weren't spending with their friends, the opportunities that they weren't going to have that year. And what they really were saying is, what they were embracing was this notion that they are part of, they are doing what they need to do to help them, their families, and their communities survive. And for some of them, that meant taking on a tremendous toll. We know that, for instance, children who are in households of limited income took on work. They took on their sibling care, elder care, and they were doing this all and still telling us, we reject the narrative of loss. So I want to make that very clear. The other thing I think it's important to be clear about is that challenge is known and to build strength. And amid the struggle that is here, there are opportunities for young people to grow and strengthen and figure out and learn how to navigate amidst and through the struggle. And they have done that in remarkable ways as well. So now the pandemic toll, those sort of disclaimers notwithstanding, the toll has been significant and it is ongoing for students and for children. Here are the four things that this panel sort of felt needed to happen, and the things that we needed to know better and understand better to support educators and the people who surround children to engage and provide that a more robust circle of support around them. The first is that we really do need to get a better understanding of the variation of experience in students. I think we saw this a lot through the pandemic. We're pretty accustomed to separating and looking at data and deconstructing data by race and ethnicity. We learned that there were a variety of other context, community context factors that matter: rurality versus urbanicity versus suburban living, the different student identities, and the intersection of these. I think we just don't know enough about how they all, the panel felt like we don't know enough about how they all interplay and have implications for the care that students need. And it will be really important for us to understand that, to better be more strategic and targeted in our support. The panel really felt like we needed to double down on exploring innovations around the delivery and scaling of support. A leading response to greater need in schools is greater FTE, and that's not a sustainable solution necessarily. The scale of need that we're probably talking about now is just too great for that solution, and so the panel was talking about and really emphasize the need for us to start to really focus on technological solutions to support students and to enable educators and providers to support students at scale. They also talked about alternative models. The pandemic sort of surfaced a lot of new ways of delivering education and support to students. There was a movement around pandemic pods. There were different learning environments. There were hybrid schedules, and really understanding, as Josh pointed out, what we can learn from those experiences to inform what we might do in the future. The third thing the panel identified was we really need to much better leverage the community assets that surround students, community leaders, neighbors, faith communities, parents, all can be mobilized to provide and create that circle of care around students. But right now, we don't have good resources that even go to parents, much less members of the community, on how to support children. There are countless cases of parents whose children suffered through various mental health crises in the pandemic, and they were at a loss as to know what to do. We need to certainly better start there, better support parents, and really figure out how to get them the resources and information that they need to care for their children. And finally, and this is always the researcher's delight, we need to reimagine measurement. If we cannot monitor, we cannot improve if we cannot measure what's going on. And few large-scale assessments have been validated to measure students' social and emotional competencies. We also lack measures that would help us understand how students have coped with the challenges that they've encountered, and we haven't really thought about how to do any of this measurement in remote contexts and remote learning environments. And so that also needs to be sort of on the agenda. With that, I will stop.
All right, well.
Great, well, thank you all for your presentations, very helpful shaping of the conversation. I do have a question about, did we do things well during the pandemic or did we not? And, countries around the world varied in the extent to which they closed their schools, and states and districts within the United States varied considerably. In the polling that Education Next undertook, they found that the effect of closing schools was greater on social and emotional learning than on almost anything else. Parents reported that their children suffered academically, and we now have pretty convincing data from North Carolina and other places that show that the academic losses are serious. But the parents reported even more serious problems with social and emotional well-being, as well as physical well-being. So the losses were serious for kids, especially in places where schools were closed. Not so much, kids everywhere were adversely affected by the pandemic, but when schools were open, when kids could go to school, it was much easier for kids to cope. At least that's what the parents reported. So I'm just wondering, did we overdo the closing of schools for fear of COVID, and have we really sacrificed a lot because of this this really intense, not quite at the Chinese level, I will say, but nonetheless a response to the COVID problem that may have been excessive. Could you any of you have a reaction to that?
I'm willing to bite and say yes. I think what the U.S. did to schools was probably not justified by public health concerns, and was in the end quite damaging to students in ways that are going to be hard to unwind and will take a long time. I know that I'm unusual among some of my friends for feeling this way, but I went to one of my kids' parent-teacher conferences recently, and she's a third grade teacher who was saying that she expects to be the problems that she has been seeing in terms of the behavioral issues, she expects to be seeing for quite some time. It's not. I asked her, this fall will things be better, and she said they will not be. These kids will not be back to normal by this fall, and I think a lot of it has to do with the closures.
I would add that, I mean, I think during the second year of the, well, I guess the second school year of the pandemic, a lot of school districts were responding to what they were hearing from families. And so whether or not the families were properly informed about what true health risks were, a lot of school districts, especially those that serve a lot of Black and Hispanic parents, were keeping their school buildings closed because that was what parents wanted. And we did see a fair number of big city school districts that when they did reopen, very few parents sent their kids back. So that created hybrid learning situations that on a lot of polls, parents have reported that hybrid learning was the worst form, that they would have preferred fully virtual or fully in person, because it split kind of the staffing attention and it made it harder, and you were running two forms of a school district. So, I mean, whether or not
should we have kept them closed longer then? Are you suggesting that actually we opened the schools too quickly?
No, I'm not suggesting that, but I do think that a lot of school districts were responding to what their constituents were asking for. And so I think it's really hard to judge. I mean, a lot of school districts were polling their parents every month, every 2 weeks, and it became a lot for parents because they were trying to juggle childcare. So sometimes school districts were also making decisions to try to accommodate families so that they would have a plan in place for a couple of months, because a lot of the switching back and forth became very hard for families. So I think kind of either way you did it, it was really, really hard. And
I thought the pressure came more intensely from organized teacher organizations who would threaten strikes and disrupt. Don't you think that was parents are not well enough organized to really have a lot of influence over what schools do, but teachers were well organized and they were quite vigorous in their opposition. Don't you think that was a bigger force?
Paul, I think it's pretty hard to explain the patterns in which districts closed or opened based on strength of teachers unions. That's some of it, but within Massachusetts, where their teachers unions are quite strong everywhere, there was still huge variation. And the biggest single predictor of whether a district went remote for a long time was the racial composition of that district, for reasons I think that Kalyn was just articulating really well, which is that Black and Hispanic families, I think, had very deep and fears of the virus itself. So I think schools were responding to some combination of parental and teacher demands.
Bethany, do you have any comments?
I mean, I would have said the same thing Kalyn said, that that the pressures were sort of encircling school districts to take the whatever route they took. Frankly, there were also pressures from parents to reopen schools and keep them open, and do that in the context of really intense sort of virus transmission during some of the winter of 2020 surge. So yeah, I would sort of back up, what we saw, what Kalyn was describing in data quite frequently.
Well, the data that I've looked at shows that political factors were driving a lot of the decisions. You find a lot of variation by the political affiliation of most of the people in the district. And that was a driving force, but we probably shouldn't get bogged down in that. Daniel, do you want to move us to another topic?
I could. I do have a follow-up question though. So is it something that's harmful about remote learning itself that is the cause of these upticks, or is it something else? So I'm thinking, I mean, we're going to go on summer vacation now for 3 months, and there's going to be a lot of kids who are home all the time. But I don't know, is there a more nuanced understanding of what occurred when schools closed down? Or is it just remote learning itself is the cause of this?
I mean, when schools closed, a lot more closed. All of the sports shut down, the after school activities shut down, childcare shut down. There was like massive disruption to households during that period of time, and young people were feeling those disruptions too. So, it wasn't just about schools. It was about sort of this, in complete continuum of child experiences that took on a wholly new form in families and for kids.
If I could just respond by saying two quick things, in Education Next, the great journal published at Harvard, Andrew Bacher Hicks and I actually wrote an article saying that COVID is a really lousy natural experiment for trying to tease out the effects of remote learning, just because, as Bethany was saying, COVID disrupted, 20 things at once in kids' lives. And so you have to be really careful before you draw conclusions about remote learning versus all these other channels. That said, Emily Oster and a team of great co-authors of hers have I think a pretty well done paper coming out in American Economic Review: Insights shortly, where they pretty carefully try to tease out the effects of remote learning separated from the other things that might have been going on in school districts, and find, I think, pretty compelling evidence that remote learning itself was pretty clearly responsible for a substantial amount of at least the learning loss that we saw. I don't know about the social and emotional stuff, but it's a good and tough question.
Mhm.
And I would just add that we've seen evidence in school districts that did return to in-person learning sooner are still seeing an uptick in anxiety and still seeing behavioral challenges. So I would say it's not just remote learning, that certainly it had an effect, but it's very difficult to say that's the only thing that it did.
Yeah, I mean, one
I
thing
wouldn't want to say it's the only thing. What I would say is that the longer that was in place and where it was in place, we do see, at least from the parents' perspective, a much higher rate of reports about their children suffering social and emotional distress. So, I mean, and all the other factors probably could be correlated with that, although COVID did not have any correlation with the closing of schools, at least reported by parents. But parents are reporting that when the kids are learning online, either in the hybrid condition or always, they are reporting much more serious consequences for the kids.
Okay, we've got some pretty good audience questions here. So the first one says, what meaning can we construct about safe schools from these three presentations? And what I kind of infer from that question is, what is the line here? So how do you define school safety when you think about something like bullying? Should schools be defining this solely as something that's physical, or is there an emotional aspect to it as well? And I guess I'm wondering this because there's one argument that yes, we should be looking at the emotional side of bullying and school safety, and then there's another argument that says, well, kids actually need to encounter adversity and learn to overcome adversity. And so I'm just kind of wondering if you had any insights into that. How should schools and researchers be thinking about how to define bullying and school safety?
I'll just say, from my perspective, I actually think a very interesting thing is, so our work argues that school and cyberbullying both dropped during the pandemic. And actually, while folks were talking, I just quickly went to Google Trends website to see what's been happening in the last sort of year. And actually, all the search for that stuff is still remarkably low compared to historical norms. And what it makes me think, because there's clearly a lot of other evidence that in general, there are a lot of behavioral problems going on, but I actually think it's quite possible that those two things are not in conflict, that the pandemic may have changed or reduced the amount of bullying and cyberbullying going on while creating a whole host of other new or exacerbated old problems, so that we might be in a world where kids are having all kinds of behavioral problems. It just happens that they don't result in bullying, they result in other things that are going on in kids' lives. And I'd be interested if other folks like Kalyn and Betheny think that's plausible or an interpretation of some of what we're seeing here.
I think that's plausible, especially when you look at the data around self-harm. That it is possible that this is that the effects of the social and psychological effects of and mental health effects are manifesting in ways other than just sort of aggression towards classmates.
Sure, and I think we heard from teachers at the beginning of the school year, in addition to students acting out, we saw students who were shutting down, were maybe afraid to come into school, were showing signs of being more quiet. And I think, we knew that there were mental health challenges were rising even before the pandemic. So I do think it is hard to sometimes disentangle like what effect did the pandemic have? And I know there's lots of folks who are looking at that right now.
So, Josh, you report that bullying was down, and now you're reporting that it hasn't gone up. So this is sort of the good news that we very, very seldom hear from anybody out there. So you think that the news media is exaggerating the current situation?
Not with respect to behavioral problems generally. But I will say that when we tried to get data on bullying or cyberbullying from, for example, companies that districts hire to monitor internet behavior or internet communications between students, there was an element of the sky is always falling, right? Because it sort of seems like there's sort of an industry around this is a disaster and it's getting worse, so we need to do something about it. So I actually, as I said, I don't think it's a contradiction to say maybe that bullying and cyberbullying have actually gotten better for various reasons, but a whole host of other problems have gotten much worse. And so I don't want to be claiming that students on average are better off in terms of their mental and behavioral health right now. It just may be that things are manifesting themselves in very different ways given the changed environment.
I've got another question in the chat here, if we could turn to that. So the poster says personnel shortages, school psychologists, social workers, and counselors are quite high right now. And have you observed any creative solution that school districts are using to try to address some of these socio-emotional and mental health needs that you've found?
I can take that one. I would like to note, though, that I think the shortage among psychologists and social workers is the one that's especially acute. Counselors is a little bit less so. So two creative things that I have seen. I talked with a school district in Nevada, and one of the big pushes they've been making there is to put more school psychologists in their pipeline. And that was true before the pandemic, but they've kind of been doubling down now. So they created a position that was basically kind of like an assistant to the school psychologist. So they take on some of the kind of more introductory work, a lot of the paperwork filing, so that the school psychologist can attend to a lot more of the like hands-on student level work, but the other person is kind of shadowing them, working together. So they're not paid quite as high. They're another body, another staff member who can help out, who is an aspiring school psychologist, but they're kind of like a shadow, almost like a student teacher for a psychologist. I've also seen school districts create kind of parallel counseling positions where they focus particularly on off-track students, students experiencing homelessness, or students who might be in other special situations where they need additional kinds of counseling. And often that person, I saw somebody in Oregon, they positioned that person in their calm room. So that was a person that students knew that they could always go to her. They didn't necessarily need an appointment. She had access to their files and she could look things up much more quickly if their counselor was busy. So kind of creating additional positions that may not be quite as expensive or may not need to be maybe on staff forever, but you can use your recovery dollars to kind of help spread out the workload. I've seen schools doing that with their money.
We've also seen schools do partnerships with community embedded organizations that work with young people so that they have, they have tighter connections, but also sort of access to additional support that from people who know kids and know kids' communities better. Another thing that I think has been gaining sort of attention and importance in curriculum design is actually incorporating the kinds of incorporating aspects of that focus on child resilience and adaptive resilience in the context of their curriculum, so that writing prompts might have students engaging on writing about and cases of and experiences with resilience, with adaptation, with managing through struggle. And these are also things that have been shown to have positive effects for students in building their capacity.
So last week, we had the chancellor of the New York City school system give the keynote address to this conference. And one of the points that he made was that he was actually going to increase the number of safety officers in the New York City school district, despite the fact that the city council had cut the budget for that previously. They revised that decision. What do you think? And Josh, you suggested that actually close monitoring might be advisable to reduce bullying. Do you think that there's going to be a response by school districts? And was it you, Bethany, or Kalyn, who suggested that there's some other districts out there that are actually expanding their safety officer, the size of their safety officer staff? Do you think school districts are going to respond to this talk of increased fighting at school by intensifying police presence in the schools, or at least safety officer presence in the schools?
Yeah, I think that may be one response. My understanding of what research I've seen on school resource officers in the past, there's not a lot of it that I think is great, but the stuff that tries to estimate the impacts of school resource officers doesn't look great. It looks like school resource officers tend to sort of, on average, disrupt the trajectories of the students, some subset of students in the schools that they're trying to serve. So, though I don't think it's an unreasonable reaction to increased violence or behavioral problems in schools, I think schools need to think carefully about, exactly what the best way to spend their money is. But, I am sympathetic if I were a teacher or a parent and I thought there was serious behavioral problems. I'm sympathetic to attempting to do anything possible to try to make people safer.
I mean, I would say that I've seen school districts, the ones who reverse course on school policing, they've had some kind of extreme event that's happened on campus, like a student being shot or a student bringing a weapon to school, that has caused a community dialogue to rethink the SRO decision. I think more commonly what I've seen are other kinds of safety measures that schools are trying first. For example, adding more hall monitors, adding more safety officers who do not have the power to do policing duties, adding additional kind of mental health staff, or perhaps upping some kind of monitoring where there might be more cameras, or they might be asking students to use the clear backpacks like I mentioned before. So I think that I have seen schools trying that. I do think that there is a live conversation happening around what role should school police be playing right now. And in the districts that have reduced their presence, I think that there will be lots of conversation about whether or not that made any kind of adjustment for students. I will point out in Spokane, Washington right now, where this conversation is happening, they asked students to share about their perception of safety at school, and it had gone up dramatically since they took the police off of campus. So I think we should be watching to see what students are reporting about how they're feeling, in addition to kind of what community conversations are happening.
Yeah, so Kalyn, you talked a little bit about, and I think Bethany, you also talked about this in your presentation, suspensions and discipline. So I'm wondering, when we had the chancellor on last week, he talked a little bit about restorative practices as instead of suspending students, that you would use restorative practices. But then there seems to be a lot of parents in schools who worry that when restorative practices are used, that the consequences aren't strong enough. So there's a big fight, or there's a serious offense, and then the student is back in school, and some parents feel like, well, the consequences aren't severe enough, that kids are getting away with too much. At the same time, there's a whole contingent of parents who would rather not see kids get suspended. So I'm wondering what you all know about the evidence and where you kind of find yourselves lining up on this issue. Bethany, do you want to take it first?
I'll just say it isn't actually just parents who worry about that. It's teachers too. And there have been, pretty notable cases where districts have shifted their discipline policies towards more restorative practices, perhaps, didn't provide enough training and support to faculty to implement those practices. And the faculty also turn out to be quite frustrated with the outcomes of those efforts as well. So, I just would, kind of say that when it's, there are many people who are concerned about when restorative practices don't work well. It's not a trivial thing to implement and to implement well. There is evidence to support it's having positive effects when done well, but it's important to remember, like, it's not easy. And it does require, some really diligent training and continued support to do the right way.
So finally, there's a question in the Q&A about the politicization of this issue, and this could be unfortunate. Do you think that the whole question of emotional well-being at school and what should be done about it is going to become a political issue in this election year or not. We have just a minute left, so a quick round on that one. Bethany, we'll start with you.
I think it already has, actually. I think it's already found its way into the fire, unfortunately.
Kalyn.
I would say this issue hasn't been as highly discussed as, say, race and sexual identity in school, but certainly we've seen talk about social emotional wellness come up, and I think whether or not students should be screened, all students should be screened, and what privacy violations that may raise, that's certainly something I've heard parents raise concerns about.
Josh.
I have nothing to add to the very intelligent comments that these two have made. I agree.
All right, well, we've reached the end of our hour. I just want to once again thank the panelists for providing such timely information on this important topic. So thank you, and thank you to the audience. We'll be here again next week, same time, same place. We'll be looking at some very interesting studies on racial and ethnic disparities in school discipline. So please join us again next week. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
I know.
Bye.
Thanks.